So this morning we'll be talking about Abhyasa and Vairagyam. I'll get into the English translations in a little bit. To get ready for that, we're going to sit quietly. So you'll hear the bell sound. That'll go to silence. I recommend that you do the same. Mental equanimity. Naturally, after a few moments of sitting, you'll realize the nature of your mind. You might ask yourself, where on the spectrum do you sit this morning, from disturbed to dull, distracted, one-pointed, or lucid? You might also ask yourself, based on last night's Dharma talk, and where you are on that spectrum, how deeply colored is it? How saturated is the habit of disturbed or dull, distracted? Or how unsaturated, how light, how uncolored might you experience, one-pointed or lucid? As you reflect on those questions, I do encourage you not to reflect with a sense of judgment, evaluation, or even a narrative, a story you tell yourself about it, but really for the purpose of seeing, of witnessing. And now, having had a couple more minutes of quiet, if you find yourself wrestling with a particular thought cluster, you might ask yourself, is it colored or uncolored, saturated, unsaturated? Is this a painful thought, a non-painful thought? A useful thought, a non-useful thought? Is it troubled or untroubled? And if you discover that any of your thought clusters are troubled or painful or not useful, you might ask yourself then, and how attached am I to this particular mental pattern? With appreciation for those reflections, now we're going to practice a concentration technique and then see what's different. So invite your thinking mind to become more connected to the direct sensation of where you make contact with the ground. So that might include your yoga mat, the blanket, the chair, the Swiss ball, the block, whatever you're sitting on. Bring your attention really directly to those sensations. We aren't noticing sensation for the purpose of improving it, deciding that we like or don't like it, creating a story about it, but really simply to notice. These are the sensations of pressure and texture, and maybe even temperature, and how you connect to the ground, or that on which you're sitting. Now, as you notice those sensations, remind yourself that sensation comes in, and your brain has to quickly interpret if it's a threat or a non-threat. And these sensations at this moment, they don't represent any particular threat at all. So we're noticing the direct sensory experience to quiet the mind and the brain, and to appreciate this present moment. Now you may bring your attention to the direct experience you're having with your calves and shins, with the lower legs. Notice what they're touching or not touching, the temperature, contact with clothing or air. Notice yourself noticing. And then direct your thinking mind to noticing your knees, the sensations associated with the very direct experience of each knee. And again, sensation without interpretation or narrative or judgment. Notice yourself noticing. Now direct your attention to your thighs, to the upper legs. And of course, notice your ability to stay concentrated and present, and what your stamina is for mindfulness practice this morning. Notice it without a particular evaluation or a story. It's not a time to critique yourself, more a time to witness and understand the nature of the mind. So notice the thighs, what they make contact with, the experience of clothing, or air, or sensation against the blanket or the ball. And maybe how one body part is touching another. And then finally direct your attention to the experience you're having with your hips. So hip bones making contact with the ball or the blanket, the block, the chair. Again, without a particular judgment, notice if you're sitting in one hip more than the other, more front or back. Become aware of your experience in your hips and your pelvis with your breathing. And with appreciation for how direct sensation can bring you into the here and now, let's now observe what is the nature of the mind. Having practiced concentration, where do you find yourself between disturbed or dull, distracted, one-pointed, or lucid? And if there was a thought cluster that you were wrestling with, how colored or uncolored is it now? How troubled or untroubled? How painful or non-painful is it now? And join your hands together in Anjali Mudra with appreciation for the chance to practice. Bring your palms together. And then you may bow your head to your heart. Release both hands and open your eyes. That was about 12 minutes of mindfulness practice, including observing the nature of the mind and so on. I would very much appreciate hearing from you about your experience. This I like to call observations, reports, and confessions. It's easier if you say them out loud, by the way.
So for me in the beginning, after having the conversation about soccer, that kind of got filtered in like, okay, so this is like my husband's first weekend with all like taking care of the 3 kids. I mean, he's done it in hour here, shifts, but all day, so he gets to experience what I'm experiencing, right? So he's like, what do I do? Can you leave, a post-it note of like what the schedule is? I'm like, you'll figure it out. So that kind of felt that was kind of, I was wavering and distracted, and one pointed back and forth with kind of that agenda going through my head. But then when you brought us into the second half of the focus from the feet upward, all of that filtered away. So, yeah.
So that probably reflects the practice time you've already had in practicing mindfulness, as well as your ability to get focused and surrender, which is the definition of Abhyasa and Vairagyam. So you're committed to the mindfulness moment to moment, which also means you have to surrender that discussion for the period of time in which we're practicing. When you came back out of formal practice to notice your mind state, did it get to hover between one-pointed and lucid then?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Somebody else? Notice that I use the word somebody else, not anybody else. Like the expectation is somebody else will contribute.
I just think mornings really hard for me to sit and meditate because that's when I'm most energetic. So I kept trying, and then after a while you just go.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. Let's consider this. And if I start using words that you're not familiar with, just trust that it will come to you in the course of the training. We're in the Pitta time of day right now. Pitta means fire. Fire tends to be a pretty active mind, often generating information that you're going to do something with. And you have a Pitta constitution piece, a Pitta mind at the very least, if not also Pitta body, with some Vata inclinations. And we live in a Pitta culture, and you're in the Pitta phase of life, and we're in Pitta season. So Susan sits down at 10 a.m. to start practicing mindfulness, and it feels really challenging. The optimal time of day for you to practice mindfulness right now would be about 4:30, 5:30 a.m.
And option 2 would be
Option number 2 for you actually would be in the kapha evening period.
okay.
Yeah, to improve your sleep and to lessen the likelihood that the evening cycle of Pitta is going to be disturbed. Where evening cycle of Pitta is 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., more or less, we ought to be having deep sleep and metabolizing the events of the day inwardly, not gestating on them with thought.
So kapha evening is like 8 o'clock?
Kapha evening time is, right now, it's about 7:30 or 8 until about 10:30. We have a shorter kapha cycle right now because we have a bigger Pitta and then Vata in the summer. That would be your second best time of day to practice. But again, don't overlook the importance of the early morning Vata period of the day for practicing mindfulness, really making a difference for your nervous system to then proceed into the day. Is there one more person who might say how that mindfulness practice was?
I love the when I first went into it and you used the words colored, uncolored, troubled, untroubled, attached, unattached. It reminded me of Game of Thrones. I don't know if anybody watches that. When Arya was with her dancing master and he said, if you're with your troubles, and I kept thinking, well, if you're with your troubles, that's when you get, when you could get zapped, So I kept hearing her dancing master, the trouble word. And the second time you did it, I noticed that I disconnected from, I was having that thought cluster. I love thought cluster, that's great. And I had this thought cluster, and then when you said something like, how attached, what's the attachment to the cluster? And I thought, that's interesting, to start to get into that a little bit. Why are we attached to these random thought clusters that are just like, when you really think about it, it's like, doesn't feel like that big a deal, but it can be huge.
Yeah. And actually, I think I asked the question, and I'll clarify because Jay's here. How attached are you to it? Because I'm not inclined right away to ask, why are you attached to it? Because sometimes we ask that question, it turns into the opportunity to blame or shame ourselves or criticize ourselves, or to think that there's a rational answer for why we're attached to it. In fact, how attached are you might give you a sense of the gradation between like deeply colored, deeply attached, or not quite so attached. You might have a realization, this is just a habit. it's a dragonfly thought cluster. It's flitting about and it's habitual like this, or it's like a deep hippopotamus, like stuck in the mud thought cluster that you can't get out of. In the middle would be pitta. This is more like a jaguar on the hunt. So where you sense that gradation, you can start then asking, how attached am I? How useful is this attachment to this thought cluster? Is this helping me in some way? And start looking at it from that perspective rather than why. We're attached because we train ourselves to be attached, and because the human brain is looking for safety, security, anticipation of what will happen, avoidance of what they don't want to happen. Our brains are programmed for that, and therefore we do get attached in the sense that we repeat mind habits and thought clusters, especially when the mind is unsupervised. We can later, once we have a more established relationship either of empathy with ourselves or we're working with a client, we can start asking, and why is this particular thought cluster so compelling? And what might the roots of that be? But if I ask it too soon and I'm asking a dysregulated mind, brain, or body, I'm not likely to get a really helpful trajectory for that question. I might lead a person to think more often about judging their thoughts and then judging themselves for having those thoughts.
You're right.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just goes around and around.
You want to comment on that?
Well, that's actually a big part of the work that I do, implicitly and explicitly, that staying away from the why. So if you think about the why, what's going to come of it? You know why, then what? There's some sort of magic in knowing why. We have that idea. If we ask a question of an insect, why it does what it does, so we explore how it comes about doing that, and we learn something about it. And that's useful, but that's just straightforward. When you start doing those questions with the human mind, it starts branching out really quickly in all kinds of different territory that effectively precludes any useful answer from it. So I very rarely will use the word why until, like she mentioned there, far later into the work where the why doesn't mean, okay, I'm going to go off into this immediate I don't know. Usually why, by the way, is meant by IDK, I don't know. IDK is the abbreviation you use when you're writing out your notes when you're doing a Rorschach King thought test. You have little abbreviations for everything. But
people are also texting that now.
It's also, oh yeah, imagine so, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So if you ask somebody why, in my experience, 3/4 of the time, the first answer you're going to get is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And if you chase that, you'll get another version of I don't know. And so, as I say, if I don't know has a way of becoming true if you use it enough. Mm-hmm. So I stay away from the whys completely. But I have 3 other questions that I use with my clients. What is this? Where did it come from? Or what do I know about it? And then what do I want to do with it? Those 3 questions get it something useful, whereas the why doesn't. And since I do a lot of emotion-focused work, the what, well, rarely do people ever ask any of those questions about their emotions. We just have them, and that's what they are, and the reaction is whatever it is that we learn to do, and we don't even stop to question that. So it's just as quick as Gesundheit when somebody says sneeze. You don't even bother to stop and think about it. So even asking any of those questions of your emotions is a trick for many people. But the third one is unfathomable to many people. What do I want to do with emotion? What do you mean want? Emotion is an emotion. You do what the emotion tells you to do. And we've even romanticized the notion that the emotions control us. They have their way with us one way or the other. We're a victim to them. We're overcome by them. We're overwhelmed by them. I often even say, what other connotation is the word falling favorable? Falling in love. Right? It's a very strange thing. If you think about the phrases that are associated with emotions, they're almost always a victim relationship in some way, fashion. Mm-hmm. So to ask the question of why bypasses virtually all of that for most people, because their brain goes, boop. It's like a thought bubble just goes, question mark. Mm-hmm. Or like a little asterisk, like in Calvin Hobbes. Mm-hmm. But to change your relationship to these phenomena is the goal of my work. It's not that we're going to get rid of them, but to change your relationship to them such that you can ask, what do I want to do with this? I get to choose what I'm going to do with this. And if I don't choose, what the heck am I doing anyway? So I could go on weeks
that's
with that.
Very helpful. You understand, as we were saying. Yeah. And so the question that we're also asking when we say, well, and how attached am I? The second question, and that is, in what aspect am I willing to surrender? How much am I willing to soften to my experience? Sometimes that means the common phrase, and in CBT, I don't know if they say, but in DBT, the phrase radical acceptance. This is what's occurring. How attached am I to it? I'm resisting it. I wish it wasn't happening. I'm experiencing aversion, grasping, desire, and that's going to escalate the attachment. Or how much do I radically accept this is what's occurring, and thereby surrender the course of events that normally unfolds when I'm too attached. So one of my teachers is Eknath Eswaran, and I like to tell the story of the elephant and the parade when I'm going to describe Abhyasa and Vairagyam. And Abhyasa and Vairagyam together are considered two wings of a bird that help it to fly. I think you have to take metaphor as metaphor, because if you had one wing that was all about absolute committed, focused effort and one that was about surrender, this bird would fly in circles. So let's just understand that the metaphor is the metaphor, that these two things cooperate, they coexist. That when you're absolutely committed to the process, let's say, of yoga or awakening, or you're committed to understanding the human condition, maybe your commitment is to compassion or empathy or service, selfless service, that absolute commitment has to be paired with, is already automatically paired with surrender, with letting go. Yoga takes that further to say non-attachment to the outcome of the efforts. Let's talk about that in the second part of this discussion. So my teacher, Eknath Eswaran, he says in one of his books, he has a story about the elephant in the parade, and how the untrained elephant, when it goes in the parade, is taking its trunk out to the parade goers who are observing the parade, and it's picking up things like small children, bananas, hats, whatever seems to be interesting to the trunk of the elephant, and its head. And you can imagine the size of the head of the elephant. If you haven't been near an elephant in person, you can come with us to India. You get to touch an elephant or even give it a bath. But the elephant's head is huge, the ears are big, the trunk is picking up whatever it wants, and is really causing mayhem. That's an untrained, unsupervised elephant. That's the nature of the human mind. That's what Eknath likes to say. There we are. And yet if you give the elephant a baton to hold on to, like this, in the trunk, the elephant walks through the parade without disturbing the parade goers. It holds the baton and it goes. That's a trained elephant, a supervised elephant. So that elephant is absolutely committed to the baton and has surrendered picking up bananas and small children. No, not cognitively, but that's the art of training the mind so that it's in the parade, it's in the purposeful step-by-step stepping stones, as it were, of the Yoga Sutras, and not so distractible. It's surrendered. It's habituated, trunk seeking. So one way to think of the combination of Abhyasa and Vairagyam is, if I'm going to make this commitment to yoga or awakening or compassion or to selfless service, what do I have to surrender to do that? And how willing am I? How willing am I to practice that surrender? Here's a few examples of what I see as significant commitments in our current culture. People who are really committed to their TV watching. What are they surrendering while they're watching TV? Can you walk in the forest at the same time as watching TV? No. No. So they're with the TV, and one thing they're surrendering is time spent in nature. Or when we get stuck on Facebook, what are we surrendering while we're attached to Facebook? Sleep, yeah. Maybe time spent with actual humans rather than electronic versions of humans. Peace of mind often gets surrendered for people when they're on Facebook. It's very apparently very agitating. I don't spend this kind of time on Facebook, but people who do and who come to see me talking about addictive or compulsive Facebook marathons, I feel it's not helping their peace of mind. And yet it's hard to separate themselves from the Facebook, which I just used as a noun, I think. Is that how you say it? From the Facebook? I don't know. From Facebook. I'll just name it like this. What about when somebody's going for a hike? What are they surrendering when they're hiking? They're not now working on their computer. They're hiking. They're not now stuck in rush hour traffic.
Not being bombarded by media.
Yeah, they let go of media. They're not reading a magazine while they're hiking. So one act in the physical sense also has your mind present there. There are many things you surrender. And the question we have to pose to ourselves is, how's this working out? Am I making skillful choices? I think the human mind actually needs an element of intense focus. It benefits from that. That's why the baby is staring in this direction. And sometimes, what is your child's name?
Jackson.
Jackson, does he sometimes just get fixated on something and the eyes don't move that much?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
He's 4 months old. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we do crave that with the mind and also the brain and the body. We appreciate that sense like, this is what's containing or focusing me. We also have a craving for surrender, and people have translated that into negative trance, like going numb, having a timeout. What sometimes people like to say, I just need to veg out for a while. That's not what's meant by the art of surrender from a yoga perspective. I understand the need for trance, but I'd like to frame it as positive trance rather than negative trance. Like, how are you going to trance your mind to meet that need for surrender, for the ease that seems to come with surrender? And I'd like to clarify that when I translate the word surrender in yoga, I'm not talking about apathy or resignation. This question has been posed to me, and maybe not in this group this morning, but posed often enough that as you're talking with clients or students about it, it's really helpful to hear what they might be thinking without asking you the question. Surrender is not translated as apathy or resignation or losing yourself. In fact, surrender, in the best sense of the word from yoga, is an expansion of yourself, not a loss. Most often, what we're recommending people surrender are the untrue thoughts, the habitual mental distractions, the patterns that are burdening the system. Surrendering your identification with those things that actually aren't true and haven't been true. As well as surrendering the behaviors that you use to disrupt your nervous system. Behaviors like rushing, or over-planning, or oversleeping, or overeating, or eating foods that aren't harmonious with your body. So those surrenders are to promote more expansive health and vitality, as well as a larger sense of who you are in your human condition. You don't become smaller made by those surrenders, and it's not punishment. You experience the innate expansiveness that humans have access to. So that is more appealing, I would say, than our traditional translation as Westerners of what happens if we surrender. Like if I think back on some of the clients I've worked with, somebody says, oh my God, I got to give up smoking if I'm going to practice yoga. I said, no, don't bother giving up smoking. Just concentrate immensely on the experience of smoking when you're smoking. Use it as a complete mindfulness undertaking. Enjoy every act in the ritual of smoking, and practice an intensification of mindfulness while smoking. And then take that training to any other mindfulness thing you can do, like eating, walking, considering yourself in the family of things. And what I see is that they're relieved they don't have to quit smoking to practice yoga or mindfulness. And at the same time, the intensification of mindfulness about the smoking makes it less provocative. Like, the need that the cigarette smoking may be meeting gets met sooner, and fewer cigarettes are needed. And then they may fall away. What do you think about that possibility? So when we have the sense, oh, I have to give this up if I'm going to do that thing called intense focus, I would rather frame it as once we're intensely committed, and this word intense is coming from the yoga tradition, once we have that clarity and focus, it's like training your camera onto which you're going to take a photograph, the item that you're actually photographing, and you focus it. The other things fall out of your lens of attention for that time. And that's immensely relieving to the overbusy mind. It's like placing yourself in the opportunity for refuge from all of that other chit-chat and really painful thought clusters. So for a time you have this to focus on, and it relieves your brain and your mind of the otherwise distressing biochemistry of unhelpful thinking. That's why so many people, I have a sense, they feel really transformed by being in their garden. Mm-hmm. Does that happen to some of you? Mm-hmm. Like weeding your garden, pruning your garden, being in the garden, just observing the garden, picking the flowers from the garden, being in that experience of the natural world, but also intensely focused on it. And that transforms your brain chemistry and your thought habits. For a time you are in the aperture of the garden and not every other thing that in your life could be distressing. So Abhyasa and Vairagyam together are always cooperating. And when they're not, that's when we experience suffering. We don't have a sense of attention. We don't know how to hone attention. We're not concentrating. We're back in, well, it's not up here anymore. We're back in distracted, falling down to dull, falling down to disturbed. And dull and disturbed are both highly attached to the wrong things. It's a difficult thing to talk about language in English because attachment has many translations. But what I'm saying here is once your mind goes from distracted down to dull and disturbed, we are attached, profoundly attached to the wrong things, like my agenda or my outcome or my interpretation of what's wrong with me. Getting highly attached to that. That's not what's meant by Abhyasa and Vairagyam, intense focus on what's wrong with me, to the loss of the experience of grace or connection or belonging. That's a perverse understanding of Abhyasa and Vairagyam. And of course, a lot of people come into yoga and or the therapeutic journey with the story of what's intensely wrong with them. And there's been a lot of dedicated mind to that, a big investment in that. So given that, where would you start introducing the concept of Abhyasa and Vairagyam in a spiritual or therapeutic journey? Any ideas? Would you like to comment?
Should I?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I don't generally think of it specifically in the Sanskrit terms. But, I begin with the condition of acceptance, essentially, implicitly at least, that with the client that they feel accepted by me and move towards acceptance of themselves. And that can be pretty terrifying because, as she was saying, we are essentially trained to experience or have a self-perception that is rooted largely in failings or inadequacies, weaknesses, imperfections, and unfortunately a helplessness to do anything with it because it's the experience of being who we are. We essentially come to identify it using some Western language there. And so the first phase of therapy that I do is essentially the noble truth of from Buddhism of acceptance. That can take a long time. Mm-hmm. We slip into the Western stuff again. The concept of neurosis, we know the word neurosis. Everybody knows the word neurosis, but many, if not most people, don't realize that it's a shorthand version for the phrase neurotic defense from Freud, actually, per se. And there's a series of neurotic defenses, and he put them on a hierarchy of level of functioning and so on, all the details of them and all that stuff. But what most people don't realize when they'll say, "Oh, you're so neurotic," It's usually, that's probably the most common use of the word. And that is, besides being pejorative, is usually just saying, you're doing something that's annoying to me. But in fact, the phrase, the concept, exists as a way to explain what's transpiring in many, many people's thinking as they've been observed therapeutically. And what it means is it's a defense. They're called neurotic defenses because they're defending against what we don't want to know or feel. More often than not, about ourselves. That's what it's a defense against. So you're going up against a whole bunch of defenses as soon as you consider the possibility of acceptance. Defense against knowing that I have done this, I am being like this, that I am not actually this, but it's what I've come to know myself as, so what do I do then? It's extremely uncomfortable to think of things that way at all. In fact, another psychoanalytic term that I like a lot is they say that they were trying to explain why people will invest so deeply in their defenses against this kind of knowing of themselves. So strong and even severe forms of defense that some people would actually die rather than have insight, awareness, acceptance of what they are and how they've been, and that they can change. And it was such an extreme, an observation of such an extreme behavior that they coined the phrase tantamount to annihilation. Mm-hmm. That the psyche experiences even the prospect of exploring that material as tantamount to annihilation. Mm-hmm. In which case you can hardly resent or fault somebody for wanting to defend against that. Mm-hmm. And so you're not going head up against those defenses, but you're working towards the acceptance that these things are transpiring and they're not a curse. You're not doomed. It's not who you are, and to not think that it is who you are is not annihilating. Mm-hmm. And I can spend, I do long-term therapy, so I can spend years just working on that part. The cool thing is, once you get a toehold on a little wedge in there, it tends to expand, as she was alluding to earlier. That knowing that even just a little bit doesn't destroy you opens up the possibility that a little bit more won't destroy you, and it starts feeling kind of good to drop some of that stuff, and you move into that territory. Then you can move on. It starts to open up, and you can really tell with the client after a while that when they're sort of phases, you could say, I guess, that they get to a point where they're just not going to go back. And a lot of times clients don't even recognize that. Mm-hmm. And they'll even say somewhere along the line, oh, I'm afraid that I'm going to... No, you're not. You're done with that. If you feel like you're going like that, you're coming back. Because the cool thing about the thought clusters, or I use the word constellations, E.O. Heb used the word, I use the concept of neurons that fire together, wire together. They literally cluster in their firing patterns.
Yeah, the third aspect of that phrase is neurons that fire together, wire together, and survive together. Mm-hmm.
So the cool thing is that they don't just wire and fire together in bad ways. And they're not stuck that way. You can change them. Mm-hmm. And so as you begin to make those changes, new clusters come to dominate, and the others, in lack of use, they tend to atrophy. And so that's the underpinnings of the way I approach these in English.
Yeah,
Sanskrit.
Yeah, that's okay.
So I was curious, kind of going back to your question, would one kind of angle you could use in this concept is talking about the body dashboard, mm-hmm. possibly using just one small thing like hydration,
yes.
or elimination, and having them at it, kind of what you're talking about, finding a toehold with them. Yeah. So in the physical practices in yoga, I'll speak to that, and then I'll go back to the mental focus you're talking about. We could choose to help somebody develop their capacity for Abhyasa and Vairagyam
but giving one physical assignment. And I often do start with hydration. This is a part of a concept that you'll get handouts on called the body dashboard. There are 7 things on your body dashboard. Your car dashboard has a few. Depending on what kind of car you drive, it's got more or less. But if you give one assignment, like staying hydrated, automatically a person has to have enough memory to stay hydrated, a plan for how to do it, and keep themselves on their own radar screen enough during the course of a day to actually take the action. And the moment you pick up the water glass or the water bottle to take that sip, you're reinforcing Abhyasa, and you're also surrendering the habit of forgetting yourself, this basic self-care getting laid aside. And that chronic self-care abandonment is actually painful to the human system at a mental and physiological level. So the body dashboard is a way of training people to put themselves back on their own radar screen, to care enough to build a physiology that's more resilient, and therefore a brain and a mental state that's also more resilient. More resilient in this case means it's more flexible, it's more willing, it's capable of adaptation, curiosity, it's less sinkable or collapsible, and less likely to get into positions of power or dominance over others. So cultivating that in the sense that the body dashboard can lead to physiological and then mental and even neurological resilience, that's a great place to start, particularly as a yoga therapist, introducing a concept and how you're going to practice that concept. When you come into the mental realm and a person walks into your office or your clinic or your studio and or working with yourself, you can ask also about the mind. And I drew this picture here representing Abhyasa and Vairagyam. So this outer circle, I called it the aperture, like when you have a camera and you're about to focus the camera. Sometimes we focus it in a macro lens. We get a really immense picture of something very tiny. Those are really cool, I think. And sometimes we're focusing it like a wide-angle lens. But we actually have the capacity for changing that. Is it going to be a more macro lens where we're looking at something very tiny, a more wide-angle lens? What are you doing with the aperture? The challenge has been when people put intense focus on or effort towards believing what's wrong with them, as Jay was pointing to, their defenses for maintaining that and the conviction about that gets stronger. What they've surrendered then, outside of this circle where it says surrender and non-attachment, what gets surrendered is the possibility that you're more than that thought cluster, or the possibility that you don't have to be rejected or annihilated because of that thought cluster. What gets surrendered is the sense that you could be okay, that you might be acceptable, even if that thought cluster doesn't change radically. So the intensification of those beliefs about oneself causes a painful experience of surrender because you lose touch with what yoga calls ananda, that indwelling grace or sense of belonging. So where I like to start in the therapeutic process is also what Jay was saying about acceptance, but I also like to put on the table the concepts that yoga teaches that I find very kind-hearted. So I start with psychoeducation about that. This is one of the illustrations that I'll often use. Like, I'll tell a person, this is where you've been focused. These are the losses you experience as a result of that. Is that okay with you? Usually the answer I get is no. It's not okay with me that I've lost touch with awe or expansiveness or the possibility of love and belonging. It's not okay that I'll never be accepted if I keep pursuing these thoughts in this intensely focused way, the ones that tell me that I'm bad or wrong. It's really fundamentally not okay, and so I'm constantly in conflict with myself about that. I'm pursuing this story, but I don't believe it completely. I believe it most of the time, and when I feel the pain of believing it enough, I numb out and use tools to go to that negative trance so I can escape how painful this is. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So the alternative then is to start training somebody, and I love what Jay said about that little, you get a little wedge in there. I like to also look at this as a tunnel that we're going to enter. And most people have, I don't know if you guys have this experience, I have had too many times as a passenger in a car. I was in several accidents. So my apprehension about certain driving moments is probably bigger than other people's. But if you look at when you were watching cartoons and you saw the tunnel on the cartoon, it was really tiny in the distance, and the cartoon character, you're looking through the cartoon character's eyes for a moment, and it looks like the character won't fit in the tunnel. Do you have a memory of this? Anybody get it? So if you're actually then driving on the road towards a tunnel, and I think of the 405 tunnel often, where traffic's going to be merging, for a moment your system is doing countless actions. Your brain is highly innervated to figure this out, that you're going to get through that tunnel okay. But if you slowed it down and asked, you would actually feel the apprehension that's coming upon you. Traffic will be merging and entering something that looks too small from a distance. Of course, when you get to the tunnel, it's obviously big enough for the car. And you know by memory that your car is going to fit in that tunnel with the other 3 lanes of cars. But that bit of apprehension right there is like the apprehension to change your relationship to thought and mental habit and to undertake the spiritual journey, or the psychotherapeutic journey, or the journey of awakening. So right there, that little apprehension. Then we go into the tunnel, and that's where we're practicing Abhyasa and Vairagyam. Inside the tunnel, we can't see the forest, we can't see the sky, we don't see the river, we don't see the immense, lovely city of Portland, we just see the tunnel. And on the other side, your awareness actually does this process of re-expanding and feels more spacious, and you don't mind the other cars as much because now there's more room if somebody else were to swerve and be in a difficult situation. So if you watch, your hands start to hold the wheel differently, your eyes dilate differently, your nervous system is going through some machinations to get you through the tunnel. Then it relaxes on the other side. Like this, once you start practicing Abhyasa and Vairagyam and really working with your inner material, you are for a time in this tunnel. And on the other side, it's going to be a lot more free, more expansive, more kind. There's more options. But the tunnel is a part of the process, the intense, focused effort. And I like to think of it as a way to practice mindfulness and say, we're going to narrow your aperture down towards this. And for a time, we surrender the difficulties of the human condition and cultivate that loveliness that we're capable of. Once we have that skill, we can use this process to dive into anger or resentment or fear, love, the poignancy of compassion, self-compassion, other compassion. We can use this process to go through like the tunnel experience of any of those emotions, but do it with skill and thoughtfulness. As a person holding the space for that journey for your students or your clients, you have to have done this yourself several times. So you're not going to knock them against the side of the tunnel. Does this analogy work for you guys okay? You understand?
Sarahjoy, what's
Yes.
the word under the last, what's on the bottom?
Effort towards. So Abhyasa and Vairagyam means, on the one hand, intense focus and effort towards the goal of yoga. And then on the other hand, non-attachment, surrender. And I love to quote David White at this moment. I hope I'm quoting him with loyalty here, with accuracy, when he says, he's encouraging us not to think or plan. He says, don't think or plan because what you can think or plan might be too small for you to live.
Yeah.
In other words, like that non-attachment or surrender is the concept there isn't that it's all going to fall apart, you don't get to enjoy the outcome, or you don't get to help sort of steward the outcome. The surrender is what you think the outcome might be is probably smaller than it will be. But the path of yoga isn't just going to steady your life. It's going to expand your capacity to love. And most people are coming in saying, I just want to feel more stable. I just want to get things under control right now. I just want to understand myself a little better and manage my relationships better. But yoga is actually going to be, it's like this much more expansive experience of ananda. And so therefore, non-attachment means don't plan it to be too small on the other side. It's going to radically transform your life in ways you can't imagine right now. You want to comment on that? I feel a thought bubble over your head, and it's more than an asterisk.
I agree with that, and I think a really important part therapeutically is to accept that the person actually is coming in with their preconceived notions about what's going to happen and what is possible, and to not squash that. Just kind of assume that it's the case, find out what it is that they're planning on or expecting, and don't go up against it necessarily. it's kind of sneaky or insidious in a sense that if you just get that little toehold in there at some point, and you let the person continue to hold what is going on instead of going up against it, then you can bypass a lot of the defenses that will come up right off the bat. So it's not a matter of, I don't think that she implied that was the case, but it occurred to me that it's not, you don't want to re-educate them in the first meeting that we're here for the wrong reason.
Right, thank you for clarifying. I certainly didn't intend that. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to say, in fact, I'm probably just saying what you just said, but that is such a rich acceptance. That what I've found is that when people come in and say, this is all I want to do, and I say, okay, that they suddenly see that they could ask for more, right?
Yeah.
So
and we are, and my style is to meet a person with what they come in asking for, while also using the lens of yoga to say, let's not forget that what's most indwelling, and this is, I've been writing a lot of articles for blogs and so on because I've got invitations as a result of writing a book, and I get to say what might be unique about the lens through which a yoga therapist is looking. And one of those things is how we see the essential nature of the human being that is different than how we might be seeing through the lens of another system of thought. And that is, most indwelling is this thing called ananda. And if I see that consistent enough with my student or my client, and I want to give them a taste that that's the lens I'm looking through, I want to do it in a culturally competent, language accessible manner. So I'm not overwhelming the system. But I also like to say, I'm going to help you meet your needs. Even if it comes in as symptom abatement, let's say for self-harm, symptom abatement is really great and very empowering. And if I'm able to proceed in a way that builds relationship methodically and safely, we're probably going to go past symptom abatement to recovery at large, not just lessening symptoms. Yeah. You followed okay what I was saying there? Yeah.
And I would just say, with our sense of kind of isolation in our culture, just having that support of someone saying, yes, I'm going to help you. It's like, oh, wow. Wow, I'm going to have help with this? That's the thing I've been, struggling with or whatever, and just knowing someone's walking the path with you, it just allows that even more, the surrender to happen.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we live in such a culture that's opposed to our fundamental interdependence. We actually can't escape it. As I've said this before, and I'll say many times again, we have social brains. We rely on each other to survive and to thrive and to evolve in all the ways that we can.
That guy over there, he's right there. Pure blob of Ananda.
He's got a moment that's real good.
Yeah. Some of the messages that we get that aren't about Ananda include when we're going through the school system, we get indoctrinated into the belief that we have to do something to be somebody. We have to accomplish and prove our status and our capacity. We also have a number of religions in this country, though the primary, I hear from my students, their Christian upbringing might tell them that they were born as original sin. Maybe this is heavily Catholic, and I don't have much religious background myself, but I have a lot of people say to me, I'm a recovering Catholic. And I do hope we can recover from that Puritan work ethic, indoctrinated school ethic, and the sense that you have to sort of live with the chronic feeling that something's wrong with you and we're just going to get by until we die. That would be a very unfortunate way to live your human capacity. Yes?
I was just thinking when you asked a long time ago, where would you start to introduce these concepts in your practice? I guess it really depends on what your tools are that you're bringing, but I would say that for me, being like a really cerebral person, it actually was so helpful to just have a physical yoga practice and to experience effort and surrender in my body without any other information or context of like what was happening, because my body worked it all out, and then I came to some of these insights after practicing for years and years, just like, oh, this is, I don't even need to mentally work out effort and surrender, because I just did it in my body, and now my mind is totally synced up with that state. Which I know you're going to talk about the role of asana, so I guess that's will relate to that. But I think for somebody like me, it's helpful just to dissolve what you called last night the false dichotomy of the mind and body, and just remember it's in my body. It's what's in here is in here too. So and that's when. So where do we start in the practice? We can start with understanding this process ourselves. So let's say as a practitioner, my intense focus on surrender, I have to be able to dance with the student or the client. So if what I'm getting is moving left, I'm going to move left with them, which means I'm surrendering moving right. But what I'm getting is I have to tell my narrative a little bit more. I'm trying to follow the narrative with them and stay close enough in relationship that I might be able to bring us back to the purpose of what we can do together. I'm not going to pull them back roughly. So that kind of dance, I'm surrendering for a time, staying committed, and then hopefully we get to come back. We also can do psychoeducation. We can give deliberate practices within the session where we practice mindfulness and demonstrate the narrowing of the aperture and the potential freeing of the mind. And then there's the really potent experience of asana and pranayama, that is physical practice and breathing practice, which I say very potent here because they have a direct impact on your biochemical, physiological experience of your brain and therefore your mind. And they each require intense Abhyasa and Vairagyam to do it. Even to do downward dog pose. We might take it for granted ourselves because we've done countless downward dog poses, but to do it you have to oppose gravity. And you have to be willing to take that action, put it into place, and the act of doing it, your body is working out which muscles will act, which ones will let go. So that metaphor is really evident in the body right there. And you can start to see in somebody's body narrative where muscles are holding on and other ones have let go. So that we might call that weakness and tightness. And we're going to start navigating those things together. And there are common body narratives. Like you can call those body postures that tell stories, like a collapsed chest. Tight muscles here at the pec minor or pec major. Shortened neck muscles from a forward head position with a computer. Shortened psoas muscles tell a body narrative. Hip flexor tightness tells a body narrative. Intense tightness in the calves also tells a body narrative. Weakness in some other muscles tells you more about the story of the person. So we're looking in that way, not just to practice asana, but to choose the yoga poses that help to address the body narrative. If I have weakened upper back muscles and tightened front chest muscles, I'm going to have to make some intense effort to change that pattern. And along with that, I'll be asking some muscles to surrender their holding pattern and other ones to get stronger. So right there you're navigating in the physical structure of the body. Likewise with breathing, I think it's very provocative, and we should not underestimate the experience of effort and surrender with breathing. So just as a general helicopter view, what I've seen most often, people don't naturally, as they're living their life now, under today's current stress, they're not naturally lengthening their exhale. Well, which part of the breath cycle is more about surrender?
Yes.
Yeah. And we have a shortened, chronic, pervasive, habitual shortening of the exhale in our culture. So you pick it up from, you'll have to notice this, right, in your family system, because you do pick it up. You absorb osmotically what the breathing patterns are around you. You organize yourself to that. So we pick it up in the family system, in the community system, in the culture system. You can see it in TV and movies. And thereby we start reinforcing the habitually shortened exhale. Which part of the breath cycle is about action? The in-breath, yeah. And so we are an action-oriented culture. We tend to overemphasize that. So you start working on somebody's breathing, you're going to be addressing a really fundamental thing about the nature of being human. And that is, you're a lot more fragile than you realize. You're much more interdependent than you realize. Your life is precious and short, and it will come to an end. Sorry to be so blunt, but most people are living in forgetfulness about that fact. So if you look at in-breath like this, inhale, pause, exhale, pause, the exhale, surrender here into pause, is that moment we call shavasana, like the corpse pose. Inhale, you come to life again. Exhale, pausing. Each breath cycle represents the life cycle. That's pretty terrifying, really, if you're going to practice pranayama and consider that. And pranayama has to be cultivated slowly and with a mature attitude about what you're doing. This weekend I'll be teaching you breathing interventions to help change someone's breathing pattern from reactive or secondary respiration back to primary respiration using the diaphragm, which is our primary breathing muscle. But for lots of us, when we go to chest breathing, we've activated the possibility of fighting or fleeing our circumstances. That can feel really empowering. Yoga's going to suggest, come back to the diaphragm and accept your circumstances. Tap into resources that are bigger than you realize and consider a different approach. That all requires surrender. Just to consider that possibility requires surrender. Now you, as regular students of yoga, may be far enough down your path that you've forgotten how scary that can be to a new person or a person in great distress. Do you have a close enough memory of it? It's okay.
I still don't like to hold my breath.
You don't like to hold your breath?
When I practice breathing and then I eat in two counts, there's a panic behind it.
Yeah. That's very common.
And in my brain, I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. You can take a breath any moment you want, but there's this panic that happens in the body.
Yeah. It's very real. Right? And so we're kind of titrating towards that getting easier and more acceptable to your brain and body. But if you were to work, let's say, one-to-one with a yoga therapist, sitting with those moments, we might understand what the panic feels like. And sometimes I would then choose to greatly increase the feeling of panic, so we might amplify it in the body and the brain and try to understand it, like taking that picture of something very tiny but blowing it up really big. Or we might help you divert the experience of panic by changing other breathing styles to make it easier to consider.
Something like that, I'm sure there's a million different reasons that could have happened, but it's not clear to me why that feels that way to me. I think of other things like not liking to be underwater, not hating to be held down, even in fun always happen. I'm sure it's connected to something other than just genetic. I mean, it must be experientially connected to something I don't remember or I don't. I don't know what it, is this true? It's often connected to something other than just my body doesn't like it.
Quite likely, yes. That's a good hypothesis. Having to realize the why may postpone the release of the pattern. We might spend more time trying to hunt down the why when we could bring relief sooner. And sometimes in the relief, you realize the why without cognition. You might not have a narrative intellectually, but you might have a body memory. Sometimes that body memory is pre-verbal, so we can't put cognition on it.
Also the memories, the body memories, or memory, however you want to put that, are a product of the time that they were established. So, for example, essentially what you were alluding to, at least, is a very common notion that there's some, as I put it, some sort of deep, dark cause for all these things. And in some cases that's certainly true. However, for Jackson, something that would be utterly inconsequential to us could be tantamount to annihilation. And that, I mean, you can imagine something happened at that age, that's traumatic. The tiniest thing could be traumatic to them, and it's ingrained into your body and your brain in that way. So it may, at some deep level, feel huge, insurmountable, deeply threatening. But as adults, we have considerably greater resources and perspective to deal with these things. But if it's carried in that core way, it still has a quality of the same level of threat. I think a lot of times people, even if they have had traumatic experiences in their past, they forget that they have resources. They relate to it in the way that they experienced it, and they lose track of the fact that they have a great deal more resource to address the issue than they actually feel in their body or in their mind. And so rather than look for the why, like she was saying, I think it's maybe better to think about, given what you are and what you know about yourself at this point in your life, what you can do with what is true now. And not even look for the whys. Even if there is a why. And oftentimes finding out something like that can be useful, but if you don't have the tools to deal with it before you go looking, then you're just as likely to, so to speak, re-traumatize yourself. Yeah. Create another condition in the modern sense, in the modern time, current time, wherein you position yourself as helpless to the phenomenon again.
You follow all that? Which is also why I recommend that you actually have a guide or a yoga teacher or yoga therapist or someone who can help be near enough in proximity that your nervous system could regulate with somebody else's more stable nervous system while exploring. And like I said, I might radically amplify your experience, or I might find a way for you to move around it and experience success. You have more likelihood of being willing to move through it and not have it be the thing it's fantasized it's going to be. Last time we talked about fantasy as one of the 5 ways that the mind operates. And sometimes fantasy is really based on misperception. And sometimes fantasy is based on nonverbal body memory, which Jay is referring to, like at Jackson's age, he doesn't have cognition yet. As wonderful as he is, he's not that special to get cognition at 4 months old. She's the grandmother, so yeah. Fortunately, he doesn't have cognition yet. Like, it's a blessing that he doesn't have cognition yet. So we'd have to be working like a little bit of a dance. Where's the safety factor for your nervous system to be willing to explore it, so it doesn't become something that in current time, as Jay just said, is now also made uncomfortable, and you have deepened your resistance to it. Because as you know, you just said it a bit ago, having a 2-second pause for the exhale is not really a big ask of the body. You know this from your grown-up biological cognition, but your body has something else going on. It's signaling you. Yeah. Which is also a good example of that little wedging thing or the small tasks, because if you can find a way to go to, just 50% more and survive that, then you're telling your nervous system that, hey, I guess I survived that. And then you do another chunk. After a while you do that. It's kind of hard to imagine, but with regular practice that doing pranayama, I got to the point where I didn't feel the urge to breathe at all. It was just as if the air was just kind of like hanging out between me and the atmosphere, and it was just like air. There's no problem, right? There's no problem getting it. It's all around us, and it's all doing what it's supposed to do, and it's really kind of cool to not, just ironically perhaps, to not breathe.
The only time I felt that, and it's for moments, I was deathly afraid to even snorkel. But I'm a fan of the water. It's just like this weird, I know I do have memory of where some of that's come from.
There you go. Yeah. There's the precedent.
So I finally did. I couldn't stand anymore. I had to see what everybody was doing, and I got in, and it took everything in my power to put my face in the water. And I can breathe. There's this thing, And I got in there and started to struggle, and then was able to, and before this practice even, was able to find this little spot where I became complete awe of the bottom of the floor that I could then see, because at first you can't, and then you can.
Right.
And so, and I saw it, and was just like, oh my God. And I could go, I went for, I'm sure it felt like 10 minutes, I'm sure it was a minute. And then all of a sudden, like, oh my God, your face is in the water, and this whole thing happening. And then I'd have to go through the process again in order to stay in the water long enough without absolute panic.
Yeah.
That's a great practice.
It's a really good example of Abhyasa and Vairagyam, actually, because you had to put intense, focused effort and will right use of will, third chakra. You were in the other training, so I'll mention. Right use of will to put your face in the water and realize that you could do it, which also meant surrendering all the resistance that you had to putting your face in the water. And you had, it sounds like you had companions. Other people were also snorkeling.
Yeah, but then, you look up and the boat's back there and they're gone.
Right. This is true. I've not had that experience snorkeling, but what I meant to highlight there is that you saw other people also doing this thing.
Yeah.
So your brain has
stops before I could even do it. What am I missing, kind of thing. Yeah.
But you took in the visual image of other humans actually putting their faces in the water with the snorkel up so that they could keep breathing. You also heard their anecdotes and their stories, so you had enough proximity. This is a really important concept from my perspective as a yoga therapist. Enough proximity to seeing this happen, and people weren't annihilated. So your brain was slowly taking in those images, and you're reconsidering the possibility of. This is one reason why group practice can be so powerful, and why I do small group therapy, is that often it's just proximity that a person can tolerate. They're not taking on the homework yet. They're not really listening to my discussions. They're doing some of the yoga poses, but not a lot of them. Mostly they're lying down, and it's just proximity that they're in the room during the yoga therapy class. And this is a more common experience for me when I'm working with disordered eating patterns and eating disorder students who have eating disorders. And I think that's incredibly valuable, just to have proximity. And so just to underline that. Well, since we're talking about breathing, let me now highlight, and I'm going to introduce Jess and have her come to the front of the classroom because she's going to be here to assist today also. You can stay there, but she's going to come up next to you. So some of the tools that we use in yoga therapy to help train the Abhyasa and Vairagyam and to overcome the narrowed down perspective a human has on what's wrong with them and to reopen them to the capacity on the other side of the tunnel. Some of the tools we have are pranayama and asana. So one of the things that's consistently true about humans is that we have the capacity with our will to change our physiology. We do it with thought, we do it with substance, we do it with activity, we do it with the breath. Because we can change it, we do. Once we learn that we can. And we learn that, again, pre-verbally before we have cognition. So I'm going to ask Jess for a few minutes to talk about your experience with yoga therapy and also your trained aspects on breathing with singing, what you know about that. She's a professional singer and a yoga therapist. So.
Well, I can speak first from my own experience, kind of befriending my own breath as an opportunity to find the present moment has been a huge tool. I think I first experienced that in high school when I first started exploring yoga and also singing and finding kind of that space within myself to be present with my breath and working with it. It was my first kind of glimpse of finding moments where my mind felt a little bit more steady and still. And I think when working with clients, it's something I tend to notice even before we really come to session. I'll observe them when they first come into the hallway or we walk into the room. I'll start to observe even then their relationship with their breath, where in their body they're breathing. And that will continue into just the first few moments we start talking to each other, just to kind of get a sense for where in their body they're breathing, and that can give me a little bit of a sense of maybe their state of mind. And I think depending on their desires for seeing me, I'll usually at some point talk about the breath, even if they're coming in. I have one client who has chronic headaches, and we still end up talking about her breath and the different poses we do. So usually Ujjayi is pretty standard for me, depending on whatever someone's coming for. But do you have...
No, that's helpful.
That's helpful?
Yeah.
Okay.
So she's coming from a yoga therapy and a professional singing background and understanding that the primary breathing muscle we have available to us is called the diaphragm. But as I was saying a bit ago, that this practice of effort and surrender simultaneously in the body is to change body narrative and to address breathing patterns. So what we see when somebody's system is chronically under the siege of that collapsed perspective of what's wrong with me, we see breathing patterns that reflect the brain's urge and its perceived necessity to fight or flee, to freeze or submit, also called collapse. So if you divide this here, above this line you have the sympathetic nervous system response, and below this line you have the dorsal vagal parasympathetic nervous system response. You'll get a lot more words about that as the training goes forward. But if a person is living with the chronic patterns of breathing that are fight, flight, freeze, or submit, that's become the new norm. And asking them to transform that, asking them to consider changing that, we are asking them to surrender something that feels familiar, helpful, nourishing. It actually feels like the right way to breathe. So I can speak anecdotally when I work with the officers, because they're not yoga cultured, so they don't mind interrupting and just saying whatever's true for them. They're a lot more vocal than you guys, actually. So when I was first training the officers, I had a group of 60 in one room, sitting around a conference table with a trail of candy bars around the conference table too, to keep them interested in the conference, apparently. I was a guest speaker to talk about breathing, so they had their coffee, they had their work uniforms on because they came from shift or were going to shift. The men full gear, and they were sitting around this table, arms crossed over the chest, as this short flip-flop wearing yoga teacher came in to talk to them about breathing. And as I was describing the diaphragm as how we breathe and giving them the science of breathing and so on, I could observe them, like Jess says, when somebody walks in the lobby, you start observing from the first moment you meet somebody. I could observe them listening to me like this. They were not that interested in what I had to say, and because I was following a couple other hours of verbal presentation by the other teacher for this course, I think they actually needed a break before they were going to hear me talk to them about this. So when I was watching that pattern, I just said, oh, you guys, let's stand up and do something about this before I teach you more about it. Before I say more about it, let's do something about it. So I taught them some simple breathing interventions that could change from chest breathing, arms across the chest breathing like this, to actually diaphragmatic breathing. And there I got them to start talking to me, because they said, this doesn't feel natural at all. This isn't right. I mean, if this is natural, why am I doing it the other way? If this is how I'm supposed to be breathing, why does my body not do this even when I'm sleeping? Why am I all day long not experiencing that if you're telling me this is the most natural way to breathe? And the answer is, because we can culture ourselves away from what's most natural in our breathing. And I said earlier, you see it in your family system osmotically, you get it in your community system osmotically, you get it in your culture osmotically. Their culture is one of intense vigilance and hypervigilance. So what they see, they become an officer, they walk into a prison, they have the adults in custody, their breathing patterns, they have the supervisor's breathing patterns, they have the 10, 20, 30-year officer's breathing patterns, and you're a new officer, you walk into that soup and you start adjusting your breathing pattern to the environment. And that becomes the new natural thing to do. Well, unfortunately, that kind of breathing pattern can trigger the brain to stay in chronic fight-flight biochemistry or chronic freeze-submit/collapse biochemistry. And any existing underlying trauma that might have seemed innocent is now getting stimulated all day long inside their own system. Whether there's a cognitive memory of that trauma or not, the body has its narrative, and the breathing pattern is now stimulating it moment to moment, day in and day out. We start to see the chronic health patterns that result from that. So in teaching the change of breath, let's really consider it takes some concentrated effort to make this difference. It requires more surrender than effort, but it requires the effort to surrender. This is like a Zen koan. Requires more surrender than effort, because it is the natural, intelligent instinct of the human body to breathe from the diaphragm. But it will require the effort of surrender. And if people have been conditioning themselves to be persons who get by with effort, teaching them the art of surrender is very difficult. It requires that you yourself have walked that path and you can feel it in your own body, you can translate it to theirs. We'll be looking at breathing patterns when we practice today. This will get broken down for you more. But just to review that, if we have fight, the breathing remedy associated with fight to move a person back towards optimal function is called befriending. Flight moves to homecoming. Rather than escape hatches, you come back home. Freeze goes to melting. A freeze breathing pattern is like when you see somebody has very shallow constricted breathing and the body looks armored or held. So melting is also including that the body has to go through a melting process. Submit or collapse as a breathing pattern is like the dullness of really not enough oxygen for the brain, but a person's learned to acclimate to that, like people who are dehydrated and have acclimated to it. You can acclimate to not enough oxygen for the brain. You won't feel well most of the time, but you can acclimate to it. And so we're looking at inflating as a remedy, like revitalizing their system. So this is familiar for some of you and new for others. Do you have any questions about it as I put it up here on the board? I will say this. Befriending is associated with warm regard for yourself and whatever's occurring. It's also associated with a quality of radical acceptance towards yourself and whatever's occurring. A kind of warm welcome to your circumstances rather than a reactivity. That includes befriending a migraine, befriending anger, befriending disappointment, befriending those things that you otherwise would react against. Warmly welcoming may be where we start, like acknowledging this is what's happening. I warmly welcome it to be my experience without having to judge it. And then moving towards radical acceptance, which I think is a pretty high skill to have. I suspect that our HVAC system is on 74 degrees right now. Would you please change that? It's programmed, and I don't know who changed the programming. It's not my, I don't want it to be 74 degrees in here. It's chilly. Are you guys getting cold?
No.
Oh, God. It's really
74
terrible.
For sure.
Would you please tell also anybody at DIA that that's still broken? Because if it's doing that all day, trying to cool this room up to 69 degrees while it's 100 degrees outside, we are overspending resources here. So flight, the remedy of homecoming. Homecoming essentially means the art of not self-abandoning, not having to escape your circumstances, not having to get away from what's occurring for you. Whereas fight is like a reaction against and a resistance towards, and maybe even an intense aversion about. Flight is like leaving altogether, dissociating, disconnecting, taking the helicopter up and out. So homecoming it implies a willingness not to self-abandon, even if circumstances feel painful and overwhelming, to find a way to stay just enough at home in your own skin that you need not later recover from the escape hatch that's become so familiar. Melting here implies melting our tendency, when I say freeze, I mean like a hypervacillation of the nervous system without any good options and the inability to think clearly to find a good option. So when somebody gets frozen or stunned and then frozen, it is that kind of deer in headlights moment. And melt implies the willingness to see that vacillation get bigger and to reopen to options. What would be wise action right now? Melt is also like melting fear and resistance. And inflating is associated with the qualities of optimism, hope, a recommitment, a revitalization to yourself and to your healing process. You followed that all okay, everybody?
Can you say what melting was again?
Because freeze is like a hypervacillation of a very small vibration like this between usually two no good options, like you don't know where to go, like the deer in headlights. Like, do I leap? Do I attack the car? Do I dash off to the woods? I don't know. If the deer is frozen long enough, we see what happens. It gets, sadly, often it gets hit by the car. So melt is like first the willingness for that vacillation to get wider, like seaweed in the ocean being moved. So it's a willingness to be more flexible, more adaptive, melting our fear and resistance to the whatever it was that stunned us. You're welcome. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the good news is these are breathing changes that we can make, and we make them often through physical yoga poses. You assume a certain position, your body can't chest breathe. It can't resume the fight-flight breathing pattern. Other positions, it can't take on freeze or submit as a breathing pattern. How much work are you doing with breathing with your clients, and would you be willing to talk about it for a couple minutes?
I don't do a lot of work with explicitly pranayama with my clients, although I use the old, some believe the original meditation technique of observing your breath. I teach a lot of people meditation, which is some form of observing your breath. Quite some time ago I began to use, before I knew it as pranayama, I started using methods that included pranayama techniques as the introduction to the observing of your breath. And so I've done it, unbeknownst to me, I was doing and teaching pranayama for many years before I found out that that's what I was doing. I don't recall where I got it from, some class or book or something back, maybe from John Kabat-Zinn back in the 80s or something like that, I imagine. But, or from Philip, actually the breathing one came from Roshi Philip Kapleau, his old book, 3 Pillars of Zen, back in the early 80s, I think. But, so I do it pretty regularly. I'd say I've taught hundreds of people meditation to start with, and using breathing techniques, but not particularly as pranayama per se. I found that it's extremely useful for people in any given moment to be intervening with something that's going on with some form of breathing. And I'll interrupt the session sometimes to do that. I'll make an observation and then talk about it a little bit and say, why don't we try some of that breathing thing we talked about last time, just a couple of minutes here. In fact, I was thinking about this earlier with when she was talking about this, that when you're introducing a new concept, there's oftentimes some resistance, and I've summarized that as that the bottom part of the learning curve is very well worn, because all the resistances are on the front edge of that thing, and that's why very few people ever get to mastery of anything, because it's just, oh, what if I can't, and I'll look stupid, and I feel inept, and all the resistances are down at the beginning, and that's enough to keep most people from progressing through that and realizing, oh, yeah, I didn't need to do all that. And so having some means to get through that, even if it's just a little bit, just the tiniest thing. So when I do the meditation, I start out with a simple thing that I'll say 10 minutes, but usually people don't do 10 minutes. I have a client who did 2 minutes for almost a year. 2 minutes, and she did it pretty darn near every day, apparently. And she felt bad about it and so on. I said, man, that's great. You wouldn't believe how few people do that. Not so much just in the 2 minutes part, but the fact that you would do it every day, that was amazing. And that's that little wedge. Well, she spontaneously has got it up to 7 minutes now. And that's my observation. I didn't even have to tell her that. I check in, and I guess it was a couple of months ago, I went in to check in. She said, yeah, I've been doing it, and I'm almost every single day, and I'm doing 7 minutes. 7? Really? Wow. But that's what I've observed a lot, is that if you can get that, just get that little shift in there, if they'll hang on to it, it tends to expand spontaneously. I do it with the physical stuff too, with, particularly a lot of middle-aged guys have not been taking care of their bodies at all. She certainly has found that with these prison guys. And so I'll introduce the idea of just doing, I started out just, okay, you know what, don't go to the gym, don't, bypass all the resistances to getting a gym membership and finding one and all those, there's a lot of resistances there. Just do 25 sit-ups and 25 push-ups a day. I found out very quickly that was way beyond what a lot of them were able to do. So I dropped it down, and I dropped it down, and so I came to this notion that if you're going to have somebody do something and you want to get that little foot in the door thing, it has to be doable and sustainable. Mm-hmm. And that's what's critical. It's not the action itself even. Mm-hmm. It's just something that's doable and sustainable, and it's on the right path. If you're just taking a 1-inch step on the right path, you're still on the right path. And just as importantly, you're not on a wrong path.
Right, yeah. Yeah, because you're on the spectrum going in the right direction.
So I'll get them to do 5 sit-ups and 5 push-ups now. And I'll just plunk down in my work clothes and right there on my floor. Look, you can do that. Mm-hmm. I'll challenge the guys sometimes, like, yeah, please, are you telling me you can't do 5 sit-ups and 5 push-ups? Really? Mm-hmm. And I found that guys will oftentimes do that. Remarkably, I'd say 50% of them won't even do that on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So that's just a little warning about when you're introducing these things. You got to make sure it's doable and sustainable, and you need to reinforce it quite routinely, and not in a chastising way, but just sort of a reminding way. Oh, wow, you didn't do it this week? Okay, well, you know what? Let's just do it right now. And so at least once a week they're getting it. And then they come back and they've done it a couple of times in that week, and so on. So it's you're never really going up against the system that's at play there, the system that they've been carrying around inside themselves. You're not going up against it. If they can't win it, you ain't going to win it. Mm-hmm. So you're not going up against that at any point.
Yeah. Could I add something?
Go ahead, Jess, and then we'll come back to me before we take a break.
I was just going to mention that my father, he's an emergency room doctor, and he called me a couple weeks ago. He had done some continuing education class, and he called me because he knows a lot of the work that we've been doing here, and he said that he had there was some speaker that talked about the importance of breathing and how it can shift his brain state as a practitioner from being reactive to one that's more receptive. And I think that I find that is, I referenced our work in this therapy session, training a lot in that, and that you're not only working to observe your clients and their breath pattern as it is expressing itself, but also working to maintain your own cohesive nervous system through regulating your own breath.
Yeah, so your dad will be a better doctor, and we'll be better providers and better therapists, right? Yeah. Yeah, and so one of the reasons that I want to go over this right now is because we're going to shift into doing asana with you guys in just a short while. So in the toolkit of yoga therapy, we have, as I said in the first part of this, we have a mindfulness toolkit, we have a breathing toolkit, we also have an asana toolkit. And most of the clinicians who've been through this training who have right now a sitting practice, like you sit across from your client, you have a couch and a chair, as Jay does, they have been finding ways to be creative about integrating a couple yoga poses into their practice. The poses that I recommend we start with if you're going to be using yoga are the ones, if you're going to be using asana, are the ones that shift physiology, that help the client or the student to realize that they can shift their physiology. This is a big phrase for me. I use it a lot, and let me explain why. Because as, let's say, Jackson gets older, this 4-month-old who's here now, he's going to find ways, he already has ways to regulate his physiology. His brainstem is seeing to some of that, and then his environment is seeing to some of it to help condition him as to how to regulate physiology. But lots of us, we don't get good training on regulating physiology that can go for the life spectrum with us. We have to keep updating how we regulate our physiology because our physiology is always changing. We have endocrine cycles and we have life stages, and we have, like for you, pregnancy, and for you, pregnancy, and then delivery of a baby. We have different ages and stages in which our physiology has fresh biological needs. But how we learn to regulate physiology in early life is usually to accommodate the social belonging system that we're in. So people might learn to regulate their physiology in a way that's not attuned to them. It's attuned to the environment that says, I'm not going to get kicked out of the tribe. It's attuned enough to their circumstances that they get to keep belonging, and they're housed and fed and, relatively speaking, cared for. But physiology itself is actually a unique constellation to each person, which is why Ayurveda talks about constitutions and tending to your constitution. So if you learn to regulate your physiology for a sense of social belonging, but now you realize it's not in tune with you, maybe even the behaviors that you learned aren't working anymore. Like food might have worked for a time, but now it's not working. Or exercise was useful for a time, but now you're not getting the same benefit from it. Or watching TV to numb out was once useful, but now it's not working anymore. You've outgrown the physiological strategy that you adopted. What are you going to do next? What a great time to use crisis to transform your life. So you may say to the client or the student, and also for yourself, how can I adjust physiology in a way that feels as effective, as immediate, as accessible as what I've been doing with food, TV, computer, anger, relationship, sex, alcohol, drugs? What can I do that's going to address me physiologically, fundamentally, right now, so that I feel like that's a good commitment to make? Because as most of you know, even the thought of the behavior or the substance that people have learned to regulate their physiology with, the thought already starts to turn the physiology in that direction. Thought of cupcake later feels good in the moment if you know you're going to get that cupcake. Or thought of the drink you'll have at the end of the workday is already telling your physiology relief is coming. What if the thought, yoga pose, or positional pranayama, we might say, or breathing, what if the thought about breathing came up first and also had the capacity to regulate physiology with fewer side effects? And it can be tuned into and adjusted for all the life stages that we go through. Your physiology needs to tend to you and you to it in an intimate way. Do you understand what I'm saying there? It's all clear? There's always a reciprocity between those things. So, like when your body gets too cold, it regulates you. It tells you. The fingers get a little chilly. It's sending more warmth towards the organs to keep you alive. And it tells you to go get a sweater. When you get too warm, your body starts perspiring. And if that's not enough to lower your temperature and keep your brain from getting too hot, it tells you to turn on the AC or to go outdoors for fresh air. You're always getting the symptoms from your physiology as to what your needs are. Sadly, most of us learn to override those. So yoga is going to reorganize our relationship to adjusting physiology. And it's very empowering. What a great thing that a kid can figure out that TV numbs them out just enough, or that food feels like good company, or that playing on the swing set and playing different games feels like freedom. What an empowering thing to experience. We all want the agency to be able to adjust our physiology now towards health and vitality, not towards further compromise or contraction or more suffering. So that's one way we use asana. Asana is amazing for giving the human organism a chance to glimpse its true nature. Because what occurs in the practice of stretching the muscles and breathing into the system, you actually are resolving held body narratives. You're like cleaning the windshield on your car. You're going to see more clearly as a result. And asana nudges your breathing towards new and optimal breathing patterns that are going to become more ongoing. You can reset a person back to diaphragmatic breathing. They don't have to be a chronic chest breather for the rest of their life. I just taught this breathing practice to the officers on Thursday morning, and two of them who could form words after the breathing practice. The others were like, no words are coming. But two of them said, I'll tell you both. One said, of the two, wow, that's like a total stress dump for me. It's all gone. We did 2 minutes of this breathing practice. Wow, it's a total stress dump for me. And the other one said, I am so relaxed I don't recognize myself. Just 2 minutes of breathing. Right. So we adjust breathing back towards optimal experience of breathing. Then we want to cultivate that to be more ongoing, so that what we're working with is a better physiological state. And asana can also help us to up and down regulate, which is essentially similar to shifting physiology, but just to know that sometimes you're going to have to up-regulate a system, sometimes you'll be down-regulating a system. And you learn along the way with the client or the student. Any questions about this? Anything else you want to add, Jay? Anything at all? Karen?
So, with Abhyasa and Vairagyam, I kept thinking about the Sutra 246, you know, the balance between Steera and Sukham.
Yeah.
So it felt very related.
Mm-hmm. That sutra, it says Steera and Sukham asanam. It means that yoga pose, asanam, means to take your seat. That the seat you sit in for meditation should be steady and comfortable. So it's related, but I would say that the seat, the physical seat being steady and comfortable means that it's not going to be a distraction. And it's not so rigid that you feel tense doing it. So that the seat, the house in which you're sitting, the home, in other words, can then practice Abhyasa and Vairagyam. And we're not consumed by the mental distraction of an uncomfortable seat, or a too rigid seat, or a too tense seat. So it's not hypervigilance, it's not hypovigilance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That sutra was specifically referring to the one asana mentioned in the Yoga Sutras, taking a seat. Taking a seat like meditation. Notice that the sutras don't include Adho Mukha Svanasana, Bhujangasana, Tadasana, Vishvamitrasana, Vasisthasana. It's not mentioned. Those are all yoga poses with fancy names. So it means sitting steadily, comfortably, long enough to realize the results. And depending on, and this is also said in the sutras, depending on the nature of the person, you have to practice with mild, medium, or intense effort. Some need more mild effort because they're farther along. So it's like a little nod to the Abhyasa and Vairagyam, but we don't see such intensification. They may have already practiced, or they may not have such turbulent conditioning, like I was talking about the muddy waters last night. Person's making medium effort, might be hovering around distracted on this 5 ladder option. So they medium effort to stay focused on the practice. Intense effort is more likely required when you have disturbed and dull mind states. What to do to remedy that? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. They may all take the same seat, it may have the same appearance, but the internal Abhyasa and Vairagyam is going to be mild, medium, or intense. And no, Susan, it's not just because of Pitta that you get to make intense effort. So I know she's out for the moment, but it's not based on your constitution that you make that effort. It's based on how close are you to lucid, or how far are you from lucid, how disturbed. Intense does not mean the absence of love or kindness, just to be clear. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes break for the bathroom. We're going to be coming back for an asana practice, so if you're able to withstand snacking between now and then, I would recommend that. And lunch is at 1 o'clock, so you'll have blood sugar coming.